Yes, in today's video, we are going to see the poem Digging written by Seamus Heaney. What are the objectives of the poem? At the end of the poem, the student will be able to understand the idea or connotation of the poetic language. They can develop language comprehension, and also they can perceive the deeper opinions and attitudes of creativity. And the poem's name is Digging, written by Seamus Heaney. Heaney is the winner of the Nobel Prize. He is regarded as one of the Ireland's eminent poets of the late 20th century. His poetry frequently centers on the role the poets play in the society. His language consists of sensual metaphor and natural imagery. The poet hears the sound of his father digging the ground in the flower beds. The poet hears the sound of his father digging the ground at the flower beds. What is the meaning of flower bed? It is a bed in which flowers are growing. Flower bed is a bed. It's a bed in which flowers are growing. The harsh sound when the spade goes into the ground made of gravel brings how his father and grandfather earned their livelihood. The harsh sound when the poet or when the spade goes into the ground made of gravel brings how his father and grandfather earned their livelihood. Both the father and grandfather were farmers, and they grew potatoes. They worked hard in their fields. They fed their families with their sweat and labor. They worked hard to produce potatoes. They digged out the potatoes to run their families with their sweat, with their labor. Thus, the two generations lived on agriculture. So, from this point, we come to know that the poet's father and grandfather's profession was agriculture. They produced potatoes. They worked hard. They worked hard to run their families. So that was their agriculture was their profession. But as Heaney became a poet, we can understand the occupation of the third generation was being changed. So now we can see Seamus Heaney as a poet. So he changed his profession. He changed his work. His forefathers worked as farmers. They worked in the fields. They digged out the potatoes to run their families. But now, in the third generation, as the poet belongs to the third generation, the profession is being changed. Once their profession was, his father's and grandfather's profession was producing potatoes. But now that profession has been changed. Producing potatoes was their profession. Now the poet's profession is writing poetry. So we can see two generations, they worked in the fields. We can see his father, his grandfather worked in the fields. But now, what about the poet? What about the poet? The poet has changed his profession. What is his profession now? Writing poetry is his profession. He is writing poetry. he changed his profession. So in the poem, the poet compared his pen with the spades of his father and grandfather. So when his father and grandfather were working in the fields, they used the spade. But now the poet has changed his instrument. Both their father and grandfather, they worked for the family. They worked very hard. They worked in the fields. They digged out the potatoes. They used the spade. But now what about the poet? Even the poet is also working now hard. But only the difference between the poet and his forefathers is the instrument. He changed his instrument. And now what is his instrument now? He is using the pen as the spade. The pen as the spade. The pen as the instrument. The spade became a pen now in the hands of the poet. Once his father and grandfather, they used the spade as the instrument. But now, when we come to the poet is using the pen as the spade. So there is a change of instrument. His forefathers used the spade, but now he is using the pen as the spade. It was no need for the poet's father. There is no need for the poet's father to work in the field, to work in the garden. There is no need for the poet's father to do any kind of labor because his son was able to make both ends meet. Both ends meet. The poet can feed his father. The poet can look after his father. His father has no need to do any kind of work. He has no need to use the spade now. But why he is using his spade now? He is working in the garden. He is working. Why? Even though his son, the poet, can feed him, but still the poet's father is working in the garden. But he did not want to forget his past life. Why? He did not want to forget his past life. He did not like to forget his profession. He wanted to continue doing his profession. That's why, even though there is no need for him to work in the garden, still he is working in the garden. Why? Because he doesn't like to forget his profession. Because of that, he is working in the garden now. So, he would dig and make beds for the flowering plants in the garden. As he doesn't like to forget his profession, now he is working in the garden and he is digging and making beds for the flowering plants. So the poem begins in the past tense. The poem begins in the past tense by giving the explanation or by describing the profession of the poet's father and grandfather. Similarly, his thoughts went back to his father and grandfather who fed their families with their labor by growing potatoes. So as he looked at his father, when he looked at his father who is working in the garden, he went back to the profession of his grandfather and father, how they worked in the farms or fields, how they digged out all the potatoes. So his thoughts went back to his father and grandfather who fed their families with their hard work. They did their hard work. They did work very hard. They worked hard. They worked very hard. So, when he looked at his father, his memories went back to his father and grandfather. He lost his grandfather but he remembered him when he hears the digging sound of his father. So his grandfather is no more now. He lost his grandfather, but when he looked at his father working in the garden, he remembered his grandfather, how he worked, how he digged potatoes to run his family. Now the poet is in good position. So what about the poet now? He is in good position. He can feed his own father. He can feed his father well. There is no need for his father to work hard in the garden now. He is in a good position. His father is digging the gravelly ground. His son can employ a person to do the work. The poet, he can employ. He can take any person. He can give work to any person to do the work which is being done by his own father. But his father has been doing work in the garden. Why? Because he doesn't like to forget his profession. But still the father is working in the garden instead of a field. Now his father is not working in the field. His father is working in the garden because he doesn't like to forget his profession. The poet begins the poem with a memory of his father and grandfather. So he got remembered his father and grandfather, how they were digging the ground, how they tilled the ground, how they toiled, how they dig the ground, how they digged out all the potatoes, how they used the instrument spade. Okay, so what instruments they used? They used the spades to dig out the potatoes. And when did they work? 20 years ago. 20 years ago, his father and grandfather, they worked very hard in the fields. They digged out the potatoes to run their families. But now the poet has no need to do that sort of work to do in the fields. He can feed his father, but still his father is working in the garden. Why? Because he doesn't like to forget his profession. He remembered how his father and grandfather used the spade in the same way. So he got remembered how his father was catching hold of the spade, how his father was also catching hold of the spade. Both they similarly worked in the same manner. They caught hold of the spade. He got remembered all those things. He appreciates the skill in digging. So the poet is appreciating the skill of the father, skill of his father and his grandfather, how they digged the potatoes. His poetry centers on the role the poets play in the society. Now when we come to the poet thinks that, or the poet remembers what is the role of the poet in the society. Now he remembers, or now he centers on the role of the poets in the society. What is the role of the poets in the society? See, nowadays, even though we have so many poets, but cinemas has a great role on the society. Cinema is playing great role on the society. Because people, they like the cinemas. They like to watch the cinemas. So cinema is playing a great role, a vital role on the minds of the people. The poet's mind brings the memory of his father and grandfather lived in the past. So he remembers how his family, how his father and how his grandfather lived in the society, how they worked hard, how they digged out the potatoes to run their families. The poet compares his work with the work of his ancestors. What was the work of his ancestors? Ancestors means forefathers. ancestors, what was the work of his ancestors? Digging was the work of his ancestors. He compares his work and the work done by his forefathers. He compares his work. And what is the poet's work? The poet's work is writing poetry. Writing poetry. And what was the work of his forefathers? Their work was digging. They digged out the potatoes to run their families, to feed their families. So the poet compares his work and the work which was done by his father and grandfather, that is his ancestors. In the work of his father and grandfather, earth was a part and parcel of their work in growing potatoes. So the ancestors' work was digging. The ancestors' work was growing potatoes. That means where we grow potatoes? In the earth, in the ground. So earth plays vital role in their profession. So the poet, he remembers or he tells that the earth played very important role in their profession along with the spade. Okay, so the poet has presented earthiness in the poem. So he has presented the earthiness. He gave much importance to the earth. How he has presented the earthiness? By making use of words like gravelly ground, flower buds, potato drills, the coarse boot, handleless spade, the cold smell of potato mold, living roots. All these words, they show the earthiness. These are the words. They show that earth had played very important role in the profession of the poet's father and grandfather. But can we see all these words which are related to the earth? Can we see in the work of the poet? What is the work of the poet now? The poet's work is writing poetry. Writing poetry. There is no need to catch hold of the spade. There is no need to mention all the words related to earth. There is no need to give importance to earthiness. The poet tries to keep himself aloof from his father and grandfather. So the poet has changed his profession. He came to the profession of writing poetry. And his forefathers, their profession was growing potatoes. So he is maintaining some sort of some distance from his ancestors. He is maintaining distance from his father and grandfather. He tries to keep himself aloof from them. He is not mingling with his father and grandfather because he changed his profession. He changed his profession. And there is no need to go to the fields. There is no need to catch hold of the spade. There is no need to work in the fields. So as he changed his profession, he is maintaining some distance because he came to the profession of writing poetry. He tries to identify himself as a poet and tries to justify his identity. Yes, that is very important. He tries to He tries to justify his identity as a poet. He tries to identify himself as a poet. His forefathers, they worked as farmers. But now he is an educated person. He came to the profession of writing poetry. So he wanted to identify himself as a writer. He wanted to identify himself as a poet. So he is maintaining distance. Oh, my father, my forefathers, they were farmers. They were farmers. But I am not a farmer. I am a writer. He thinks like that. The poet thinks that he is a writer and his forefather and father, they were farmers. So he tries to keep distance from them because he tries to protect his identity as a poet. He keeps himself away from his father and grandfather by accepting another profession, that is writing poetry. That's what I told. He had taken another profession, that is writing poetry. So he wants to keep aloof himself from his own father and grandfather. But at the same time, he respects his profession. He is maintaining distance from his father and grandfather, but at the same time, he is respecting their profession. What was their profession? Digging was their profession. Digging was their profession. And what was their instrument? Spade was their instrument. And what played very important role in their profession? Earth played very important role in their profession. So he wants to keep away. He wants to keep himself away from the presence of his father and grandfather because he changed his profession. He came to the profession of writing poetry. He had taken another new profession which was entirely different from his father's and forefathers' profession. He appreciates their way of handling their spades. So he is not looking down at the profession of his father and grandfather. He is not looking down at the way how they catch hold of the spade. He is respecting the way how they catch hold of the spade. He is respecting their profession. The poet is respecting their profession. The poet is giving so much respect, showing so much respect to their profession. He is not looking down at the poet's father and grandfather. His father and grandfather, but still he is continuing his own profession by holding an instrument like spade, that is his pen. So he changed his profession. He came to the profession of writing poetry. His profession is entirely different from the profession of his father and grandfather. But at the same time, he is not looking down at the profession of his father and grandfather. He is respecting their profession. So he respects how they catch hold of the spade. But now he changed his profession and he had taken another instrument in the place of the spade, that is the pen. He had taken the pen as the instrument to bring some change in the society, to write poetry, to write poems. To write poems, he had taken the pen as the spade, which was taken by his father and his grandfather. They used the spade. His father and grandfather, they used the spade, but now he is using his pen. He chose a profession of writing poetry. So his profession is entirely different from the profession of his father and grandfather, but he equated his profession, showing his tool, that is his pen. They produced potatoes, but now he is producing literature. Their profession was producing potatoes. By producing potatoes, they maintained their families. By producing the potatoes, they earned money. They ran their families. But now the poet is producing literature. Instead of the spade, he is making use of his pen as the spade, which was used by his father and grandfather. So profession has changed. They produced potatoes and now he is producing literature. But both his father and grandfather, they worked hard. Even now the poet is also working hard by writing poetry. His ancestors worked in raining and shining. His father and grandfather, they worked hard in rain and sun. Okay. Digging ground under hot sun and in cold weather was always a difficult task. It was very difficult to work in the sun and shower. Sun and in shower. They worked. They digged the potatoes in sun. In rain, they digged out. But which was very, very difficult. Very difficult. It was difficult task. But still, they performed their task very well to run their families. They fed their families by digging out the potatoes in sun and shower. It was a rough job, tough job. It takes a lot of physical energy. It takes a lot of physical energy. They spent a lot of physical energy to dig out all the potatoes. They worked very hard. They worked in sun. They worked in rain. They worked in cold weather. They worked in hot weather. They produced potatoes to run their families, which was very difficult and which needed so much of physical energy. But what about the condition of the poet? But the poet did not choose his family business. He didn't choose his family's work. He is not continuing his family's work, that is farming. He became a poet and he is using his pen as an instrument instead of a spade. He is using his pen as a spade, which was used by his forefathers. His ancestors worked in sun and shower, but now he is working very comfortably by sitting in a comfortable weather. He is working sitting in a comfortable place and producing literature. They worked in sun and shower, but now he is working by sitting in a comfortable place. His ancestors worked in sun and shower, but now he is not working in sun and shower. He is working sitting in a comfortable place, writing something useful to the society. He is sitting in a comfortable place and he is producing literature. But what about his ancestors? What about his forefathers? They worked in the farms. They worked in the fields. They worked in sun and in shower. They worked very hard for producing the potatoes. But now he is sitting in a comfortable place to produce literature. Okay? But still, he is respecting the profession of his ancestors. They fed their families with dedication. They worked hard. They worked hard. They fed their families with dedication. The poet says that he is doing his duty in the same dedication or with the same dedication of his father and grandfather. Yes, I am also doing. The poet says that he is also doing. He is also working with the same dedication as his forefathers worked with dedication or worked with much dedication. The two generations lived in farming. His father's family, his grandfather's family, they worked or they lived on farming. They lived on farming. But now the poet's family is not dependent on farming. Okay? Both the generations used spade. His father's family or his father, his grandfather, they used the spade. But here the poet is an educated person. He is an educated person. He became an educated person. And being an educated person, he can't go to the farms, he can't go to the fields, and he can't catch hold of the spade. So, he changed his instrument. He had taken the pen as the spade to produce poetry. To produce poetry or for the change of the society. He liked writing. Why he had taken the pen? Because he liked writing. He had taken pen as the instrument because he liked writing. So he took the pen to produce literature. The spade which was used by his ancestors has now become mightier pen. That spade, which was used by his father and his forefathers, had now become mightier pen. That spade has become now mightier pen. Okay, and with that pen, by making use of that pen, he started producing literature. He started writing poetry. His family has shifted from farming to writing. So his family has changed he changed his family's profession. His family's profession was writing poetry, digging out the potatoes. But now he came to the profession of writing poems, producing literature. His family has shifted from farming to writing. His memories traveled from his grandfather and his father growing potatoes to his father digging the flower beds to his writing with a pen which he can use as a gun. He followed the cinematic technique of montage shifting. So he had shifted from farming to writing. He had shifted the instrument, or he changed the instrument from the spade to the pen. And that spade, which was used by his forefathers, had now become, what is that? It had now become a mightier pen. Now he is using his pen for the production of literature. Then his forefathers, they produced potatoes, but now he is producing literature to bring some change in the society. So it is very common in villages, sending food for the people who work in the farms. Not only in those days, even now also it's very common to send some food for the people who are working in the farms. People, they send some food. They prepare food and they send some food. So in those days, the poet, he used to carry milk to his grandfather in a bottle, and that bottle without lid. The bottle had no lid, and they used paper as the lid. Even today also, lunch is being sent to the people who work in the fields. So in those days, the poet used to carry milk to his grandfather in a bottle. So the poet's father, he used to drink the milk, takes a